So, good afternoon, everyone, and it's great to have everybody here today. Many of you know me. My name is Christian Harrison, and I'm privileged to be the facilitator of the research seminar series of the School of Business and Creative Industries. We have been having this series over the last couple of months, and we've had great speakers. And today we are having a fantastic speaker in the house today, and I'll be introducing him in the next couple of minutes as well. Well, like I always tell people, it's important you can introduce yourself on the chat, so feel free to introduce yourself, tell us where you're coming from. It has become a tradition. I tell people that they should introduce themselves in their native language if they want to. So it's great for you to do that in the chat so that we'll get to know where you're coming from and you can see what you're doing as well. So please feel free to do that. And of course, you don't need to put off your videos. If you're comfortable with having your videos on, it's always great to place a face to the name. But of course, if you don't want to, there is no problem at all. So feel free to put on your videos if you want to. And most importantly, it's so important that we try to mute ourselves when we are not talking, just to ensure that we're not affected by the background. I can see Alice has done that. So hi, Alice, thanks for joining us as well. So it's always great to do that. And I always tell people, it's not, in case of any emergency, please feel free to leave your house, leave your computer. Your life is much more important. We want to have you here, but your life is more important. I can see Craig is introducing himself in Japanese. I can't read that, but that's great to have Craig introduce yourself. And I can see Tammy as well, just joining us. And it's great to have Tammy also as well here. So it's good. And I know it's summer and a lot of people on holidays. I know a lot of people are in different parts of the world. Some people are watching Wimbledon at the moment. But either way, it's great that all of you are here. But not to talk so much. Today, we'll be having something so distinct, something so important, something so apt. And what we'll be looking at today is getting personal, the issues of trust and distrust in SMEs. One of the things that we have noticed, especially in research, is that most people have not examined trust from a developing market perspective. What is trust in the first place? How can we ensure that we look at the multidimensionality of the concept of trust? And what are the types of trust? What does it really mean when you look at trust? And this is something that we tend to, of course, from my own perspective, when you talk about trust, we need to trust-based leadership. Your leaders should be able, we need leaders that you can trust. But either way, we have an expert on trust today that will be providing much more insight about trust. So please, we have Dr. King, and I stole Dr. King's bio, so apologies for that, but I'm not apologizing because I'm happy I stole the bio in that way. So I will be introducing Dr. King. Dr. King Omeihe, thanks for coming. When I reached out to him about presenting, he was happy. I know he's quite busy, and it was great to have him here today. Dr. King is the head of discipline of business and management at the business school in University of Aberdeen. Dr. King received his diploma from the University of Cambridge and his MBA from the University of Aberdeen, and has a PhD from our university, University of First Choice, UWS. Then his previous posts include Head of Graduate Apprenticeship at Edinburgh Napier University, Executive Administrator at the Center for African Research and Enterprise Economic Development. We have the Director of CARID here, who is Professor John Strutters. So he knows Professor John quite well. He's a selected fellow of the West African National Justice Center and a fellow of the Institute of Business Administration and Knowledge Management. He advises startups, business leaders, and policymakers on entrepreneurship, innovation, and business resilience. His current posts include being the Chair of African Studies at the British Academy of Management, the Chair of Entrepreneurship in Minority Groups in ISBE, member of cross-party groups of the International Development at the Parliament, member of different research bodies, and previously, he was a banker. So he worked in several banks in Nigeria and helped with developing their banking portfolio. Banks like Standard Bank, Access Bank, Zenith Bank, and different variety of banks. I don't want to say. So these are just a snapshot of what Dr. King has been able to achieve to date. So I think we don't want to hear Christian again, we want to hear from the speaker. So I will let Dr. King start the presentation, and please, you can keep the questions, then when Dr. King is available, then you can talk to him. So thanks very much, King.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Christian, for that kind introduction. I'm actually humbled to be here. And it's good to see familiar faces like Professor John Struthers, who I've had the privilege to have worked with the Center for African Research and Economic Development, and also Dr. Ahmed Beluchi, who we've also worked together at the center. And of course, it's also a privilege to have people come along despite their busy schedules to be here today to speak, to hear me speak. Just a point of correction, I'm not an expert in trust, I'm still an emerging scholar, but of course I try to bring my own little knowledge and expertise on the area of trust, especially from particular context in which one could argue that much is still yet to be known in those areas. So once again, the focus today will be to look at how trust operates in challenging environments, of which Sub-Saharan Africa, and in particular Nigeria, the chosen context, appears to be the central core of the conversations. I always like to start up with this premise proposed by George Simmels, one of foremost economic sociologists, and his proposition here still remains apt up to modern day, and he kind of posits that without the general trust that people have in each other, the society itself would disintegrate. And building on this, I've gone ahead to try to put together a couple of slides that illuminates my research, which was undertaken a couple of years back in Sub-Saharan Africa, where I tried to explore how trust works within within African entrepreneurs. But before starting, it's quite unique to provide a research background. I think within West Africa, within Sub-Saharan Africa and West Africa, what we've come to see is a compelling growth in trade networks. And these trade networks have grown to provide a critical points for generating gross GDP within Nigeria, within parts of Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, the interesting part is these trade networks, so what we like to refer to them as small and medium-sized enterprise, they rely on their networks and rely on key elements of members' reputation to providing information on commodity prices. And the truth is, a lot of these SMEs operate in the informal economy. And the reason why they operate in the informal economy is because, one, they lack access to the formal economy, because, one, the registration and access to the formal requirements appear to be quite expensive and in most cases unattainable. And for them, they've come to rely on the informal economy, whereby they've been able to have access to resources in promoting their trade and enhancing their entrepreneurial activity. And this is because, one, within the developing market context and symptomatic of most African economies, there is the existence of what we refer to as weak formal institutional arrangements. And a result of this formal institutional arrangement, what we've come to realize is that most of these small, medium-sized enterprises or entrepreneurs face specific challenges in their entrepreneurial activities. So, for instance, they face lack of access to credit and, of course, banking arrangements, because, one, they may not have the resources to be able to access loans, and also limited resources to have banking accounts. And also, in terms of contractual enforcement, the difficulties of putting in place contracts is also very pronounced, because, one, as we'll tend to find out going forward, is that contracts within this market are in most cases unenforceable and also very expensive, and perhaps can be recognized to be for the exclusivity of the rich. Now, citing some of these circumstances and citing some of these challenges, what we've come to realize is that entrepreneurs within Nigeria and large parts of Sub-Saharan Africa have come to look at what we call alternative sources of doing business by drawing on network associations and drawing on other cultural arrangements to compensate for the weakness of formal institutional arrangements. And that kind of leads us to three key underpinning sub-questions that underpin the research of today. The first research question is, how do entrepreneurs perceive the state-backed formal institutions in Nigeria? The second research question is, how is trust developed within Nigerian context? And the third research question is, how do these SME networks enhance entrepreneurial relationships in Nigeria? I think having listened to these three sub-questions, I think an apt definition would be, what do institutions mean? But before going forward, I always like to provide a schematic view of the literature that kind of underpins the research today. Institutions, the nature of trust, and internationalization. The internationalization aspect kind of underscores the element of how these entrepreneurs look forward to their apply their exporting element of their business. So we'll try to look at what institutions mean and what trust means within the context of this presentation. Now, I think the most trite question here is, what are institutions, right? And institutions, as defined by Douglas North in 1990, are the rules of the game. And institutions are a set of shared, they kind of create those stable expectations of behavior that kind of governs the consistency of entrepreneurial behavior or human behavior. Lynn Zucker, in her seminal work in 1995, defined institutions as the socially embedded rules that govern exchange. And Geoffrey Hodgson defined institutions as established systems or established social rules that structure social relationships. But I think Douglas North provides a more interesting perspective of institutions. And he divides institutions into two: the formal institutions and informal institutions. And the formal institutions are those embedded rules, norms, and values that drive and govern individual behavior. While the informal institutions are those elements of the institutions that work in alternative to formal institutions. These can be defined as those taboos and the cultures and those social cultural elements of institutions that act in shadow to formal institutions. Now, within the institutional element, there are certain theories, and institutional theory appears to be one of the key elements within the definitions of institutions. However, there appears to be more conversations around new elements of institutional theory, which is the institutional logics perspective, which I will go into detail in a few minutes. But in research done by Marco and Leon, and one also done by myself in 2019, we've looked at the fact that once institutions are strong and efficient, right, they're able to kind of ensure that formal arrangements and trade are more proactive and more efficient. However, once the institutions are weak, there's a chance that there'll be limitations and bottlenecks and challenges that try to inhibit entrepreneurship and, of course, trade. So the adverse impact of institutions on entrepreneurial exchange is more pronounced in developing market context, where formal institutions are perceived to be weak and inefficient. Now that takes me to the theoretical underpinning of this study. And this is where the concept of institutional logics come in. Now, the question is, what are institutional logics? Now, institutional logics look at how the cultural dimensions of institutions enable, or constrain social behavior. And an apt definition by Thornton and Ocasio, building on the work of Friedman, right, defines institutional logics as those elements of historical patterns of material practices, how values, how beliefs, how cultural rules, how they affect and produce meaning to the lives or to the social reality of entrepreneurs, how socially constructed values, beliefs provide meanings to entrepreneurs in the sense that they shape their understanding of time and space and provide meaning to the reality. And from that definition, the institutional logics perspective fits perfectly well with this research because, one, the key findings from this research illuminates how elements of culture and values and how religious rules and ethnicity and norms and values provide meanings to the entrepreneurs operating within the developing market context. Now it takes us to the core of the research, which is, what is trust? Now, trust has been studied across disciplines. In economics, Diego Gambetta defines trust as that subjective responsibility whereby respondents or entrepreneurs or parties to an exchange suspend any form of thoughts or perception and appear to do business on the fact that, on the basis that the other party will behave in a way that is expected. Rosso et al. And Omeihe et al. Define trust as the set of shared exchange that kind of governs a relationship. Other influential definitions by Gambetta and Mollering kind of provide good definitions of trust. And in Mollering's definition, he talks about the leap of faith, whereby people in an exchange suspend every form of bias and going to a business or going to a relationship based on the fact that you believe that the other party will behave in a very benevolent way. But the main elements of trust are reciprocity, expectations, and benevolence. Reciprocity underscores the fact that that once we're in an exchange, I expect you to behave in a very positive way. And on my own part, you are most expected to reciprocate that gesture. Expectation means that I expect you to do your work, and you also expect me to also live up to my obligation. And benevolence looks at the part that the relationship or whatever agreement we have in place must be done in a very good way or in a very positive manner. Now, in terms of the conversations around trust, there have been two key debates and arguments around trust. And over the years, there's been an increase in consideration of context within the element of trust. Now, the two key divides in the trust argument are the ethical perspective of trust and the emic perspective of trust. The ethical perspective of trust assumes that trust is general or universal, that the element of trust within an African context is still the same that you will get in more mature economies. Now, the emic view of trust assumes that trust must be understood from a local or contextualized perspective, that trust that you will get from a contextualized perspective, perhaps in emerging context, is perhaps very different from what you get in more mature economies. Now, while both arguments and debates are very strong that trust has a general or universal perspective and trust has a very cultural perspective, this research kind of adopts a more emic perspective, saying that, yes, while trust is universal or general, trust also has very strong cultural and specific undertones. Now, in terms of trust, we have two to three main types of trust, right? The personal trust, which emerges between relationship between two or more people, also known as bilateral trust, right? And personal trust kind of emerges where people are not willing to rely on existing institutional arrangements, such as contracts. But the key element of trust is that, or personal trust, is that it relies on previous interactions. It relies on your reputation. It relies on reliable information sourced from networks of families or trade associations. The truth is, personal trust can only thrive when there's that previous knowledge, when there's that previous interactions across board. Now, the issues of personal trust that there appears to be a relative paucity of trust that looks at trust from cultural differences. Why there are, in terms of the mature economies and maybe transitional economies like Russia and parts of Europe, there appears to be a paucity of research that have looked at trust from sub-Saharan Africa. Of course, today there appears to be some kind of accelerated momentum in that perspective. Now, another type of trust is institutional trust. But before going to institutional trust, there is operating at a meso level called organizational trust. So at the micro level, personal trust operates at the micro level. At the macro level, institutional trust operates at the macro level. Organizational trust operates at the meso level. But for the purpose of this research, and because organizational trust has strong ties to personal trust at the micro level and institutional trust at the macro level, I've kind of subsumed organizational trust within personal trust and institutional trust. So within this research, we'll look at personal trust, which we've just looked at, and institutional trust. So institutional trust, as defined by Barber in 1983 and Luhmann in 1979, are known as system trust or societal trust. And the idea around personal trust is that it kind of shapes the arrangement, it shapes the way of life. It is the rules of the game. And this is because individuals or collective action are always embedded in certain macro institutional environments. Now, within the parlance of entrepreneurship, right, what we've come to find out is that entrepreneurs or exchange partners are less likely to commit malfeasance or cheat when their interactions are embedded in strong institutions, because one, they are governed by the umbrella of contracts. However, there are what we refer to as high trust environments and low trust environments, as defined by Francis Fukuyama in 1995. And in Fukuyama's seminal work, he defines low trust environments as environments that have strong and efficient institutions. And low trust environments are environments that have weak and inefficient institutions. So symptomatic of high trust institutions, high trust environments, you find that institutions are very strong and enforceable. So for instance, when we go into businesses, we're locked in by contracts, and it's ensured that contracts are able to ensure that both parties work within the terms of the arrangement. However, in low trust environments, it is opined that contracts are unenforceable and contracts are weak. So in this sense, we find out that operators and actors within this context look for alternative, or perhaps what I refer to as indigenous alternatives to weak formal institutions. Now, just to also underpin some of the work done by Zahir and Zahir in 2006, they kind of mentioned that within high trust environments, strong formal institutions provide a much needed safeguard, right, which underpin relationship. The issues of the arrangements of courts and the police force and the banks ensure that kind of underpins the fact that formal institutions are very strong and rife in very more mature economies, unlike what you get in less mature economies. I think before going into the methodological aspect, again, I'd like to kind of mention some key elements or some key concepts, the idea around networks and the idea around norms. And why norms is quite important is because, one, we're kind of drawing on the institutional logics perspective as how norms and other cultural elements kind of provide reality to the social world of the local actors. So norms are expectations that kind of confirm the way people should work and how people should behave. You know, it kind of establish a way of living that is acceptable within a society. And norms are those kind of expectations that people should leverage on, and it's kind of considered acceptable or unacceptable. And of course, norms exist when it's kind of held within a community or held within a social context. The idea of networks kind of provides an opportunity for entrepreneurs to kind of leverage on the strengths of their local community or their local associations. So networks of families, networks of trade associations, networks of religions have actually come to replace some of the informal, weak formal institutional arrangement that we kind of see in more mature economies. And the good thing about networks is that they also help these entrepreneurs provide access to market information, try to bridge what we call the cyclic distance, which is the difference between a host community and a foreign community. They also help them provide the degree of foreignness, reduce the liability of foreignness, so that for new SMEs that try to operate in new markets, right, those networks are able to provide reputation information and provide and act as guarantors to these small and medium-sized enterprises. So I think this kind of gives us a snapshot of the literature that kind of underpins this research, and it kind of informs, provides a direction for the methodological elements of this research. But before going into the methodology, I'm going to provide a generative conceptual framework that reflects the thinking of the whole research. And drawing on the work of Miles and Huberman, they define a conceptual framework as the generative form of concepts that kind of underpin the research, right? It could come in a diagrammatical form or the narrative elements. So I've kind of picked up the diagrammatical form here. So the research kind of builds on institutional logics perspective. I've taken away the concept of embeddedness. I've adopted the institutional logics perspective. I've also drawn on the entrepreneurship perspective here, as this research kind of underscores the fact that entrepreneurs are alert to opportunities within their market and are able to respond to new discoveries within the market. And this kind of shapes the elements of personal trust and institutional trust. If you recall that the organizational trust has been subsumed under personal trust and institutional trust. So it kind of I haven't gone into the trust violation element, but trust violation element kind of means that when trust is violated, right, what happens? How will trust be repaired? And how does this shape relationships going forward? In terms of the methodology, this kind of provides a snapshot of the methodological considerations adopted for the research. I've chosen an interpretivist philosophy because, one, I believe that reality is socially constructed. I think the key element here is the fact that I've chosen an abductive research, abductive approach to reasoning rather than an inductive or deductive. I think the choice of the abductive, which a lot of researchers and students often like to query, is my choice of choosing an abductive is because it has kind of become popular within the quarters of qualitative research. And I think I've also chosen this in response to the limitations of inductive and deductive research. And in choosing the abductive perspective or abductive approach to reasoning, I've been able to ground myself in the theoretical understanding of the situational logics and in the context of the respondents involved in this study. In this element, for me, I've been able to understand their meanings and their perspectives from their real view. So for the real view of the local actors. I think for me, this kind of remains crucial as it ensures that for me, I'm open to the possibility of uncovering new findings within the data. So within my research again, and just for context, this research was undertaken in 2017, and I was privileged to have traveled to Africa, and I conducted what I call a partial ethnographic approach, whereby I lived for 4 weeks with these respondents to immerse myself in their real world, or the real world of these local actors. And I was privileged to undertake direct observations, undertake semi-structured interviews with respondents and entrepreneurs of a sample size of 52 spread across 3 main Nigerian cultural blocks. I adopted the qualitative research because I wanted to understand the nature of the meanings and interpretations of these actors. Because one, I felt while a quantitative research would have been useful, I felt a quantitative research would be difficult to explore an abstract concept such as trust. And of course, I undertook a thematic analysis to identify the meanings and interpretations and patterns within my research. In terms of quality criteria, I've kind of built on some of the recommendations of CPRES in 2017, where they kind of provided some kind of criteriology around research quality. I've adopted the construct validity, internal validity, external validity, reliability, credibility, dependability, and confirmability. This is because across qualitative research, there have been lots of arguments that qualitative research is not strong enough. And for you to defend the rigor and strength of qualitative research is quite apt to provide some of this criteriology to be able to defend your arguments. So in terms of construct validity, I relied on what I refer to as complementary evidence for my research. I relied on semi-structured interviews, documentation, direct observations, and I also reviewed the draft findings for my key informats. In terms of internal validity, because I adopted the case study analysis, I conducted what I call a within case and case cost pattern matching. I also supported this with the pilot interview, and I was able to provide a strong rapport with my respondents and also establish what I refer to as effective communication approaches. And I ensure that these were recorded through my audio recordings and field notes and documentations to ensure that I'm able to capture the truths around my research. In terms of reliability, I used the case study protocol, which provided me with a set of procedures to ensure that I follow a systematic approach in my research questioning. In terms of credibility, I ensured that a truthful and accurate depiction of the experiences of the participants, these are the entrepreneurs, were captured, and this was complemented with direct observations. I also had what I call a peer debrief, whereby I conducted this through online meetings, then with my supervisory team and other experts in the field. I also referred to something called an inter-rater agreement, whereby I had a couple of experts who also helped me cross-check my thematic analysis and also ensure that they're able to validate the themes. This ensured that the degree of agreement was reached in relation to the findings. And in terms of confirmability, I relied on a very unique aspect called bracketing, whereby I went back to the respondents to ensure that I was able to capture a clear interpretation of their meanings. I also adopted a rare methodological strategy called reflexivity, whereby I was able to provide a meaning to my research by bringing the real audience and bringing the readership and the examiners into my research. So I provided in 25 pages my journey to the field, my interactions, my access, my understanding of trust, my understanding of institutions within the Nigerian context. So I think this kind of underpins Biograve's 1989 statement saying the heart of the entrepreneurial process is found in the descriptive background, and we will not be able to get to the heart of the entrepreneurial process till we observe it in this field. And this was very useful for me, spending time with these entrepreneurs and understanding how trust works within a developing market context. And this is where the emic perspective of trust is highlighted or is amplified, speaking about the cultural element of trust. While I found out that, of course, there's an ethical element of trust, which underscores the view that trust has that general perspective, I was able to come up with the cultural element of trust, suggesting that trust also can be ethic and at the same time have an emic view of it. So in terms of the summary of my findings, so these are the key summary of my findings, right? What I realized was that networks of SMEs were seen to kind of provide support in response to the weak formal institutional arrangement. So while most of these entrepreneurs didn't have access to formal institutional arrangement like courts and banks and police force, right, and also good roads, they relied on networks of SMEs, networks of trade associations. So these trade associations are what we can be defined as alternative institutions, or what I refer to as indigenous institutions. And they provided economic support in response to the weak formal institutions. So for instance, most of these trade associations provided loans to the SMEs. The trade associations acted as guarantors to these SMEs in situations whereby they try to do their exporting arrangements across Nigerian borders. Right. I also found elements of trade and religious associations acting as alternatives to weak formal institutions. So for instance, religious associations provided what we refer to as quasi-regulatory functions. So in situations whereby the courts, as pronounced by all the entrepreneurs to be perceived to be weak and being for the rich, right, we realized that religious associations, and in some cases the trade associations, provided the quasi-regulatory functions of the courts by resolving cases, resolving grievances, and of course, dispute resolutions. And in some cases, I also found out that some of these religious associations provided opportunities for entrepreneurs to gain access to loans without any need for collateral. Now, in terms of trust, we realized that trust based on working relationships was very strong and was very amplified. And with trust in play, we realized that most of these entrepreneurs did their agreements through oral and written agreements, right? So rather than relying on contracts, because of that grounded trust, there was a prevalence of people doing business based on oral agreements and written agreements. This is because, one, they understood that, these respondents or the entrepreneurs and their partners had strong, had integrity, had character, right? There was strong information on reputation. There was also strong information on previous interactions. So rather than relying on contracts, they did the core of their business based on trust, and these are oral arrangements. Now, one may ask, in terms of written agreements, right, are these contracts? And I would point out that the written agreements are not contracts. They are often what we could refer to as memorandum of understanding, and they're not backed by any legal arrangement. So it could actually be done in a piece of paper or on a piece of tissue paper. The idea is a party can ask the other party to pay me £10,000, can pay me 10,000 naira in 5 weeks. And the parties would always renege, will always keep to the terms of the contract. Recall we did mention that trust is underpinned by expectations, by benevolence and reciprocity. Now, within the findings, we also realized the strength of what we refer to as middlemen. And these middlemen across sub-Saharan Africa are referred to as transitors. So what these translators do is that they offer what we call research, rich and specific forms of resources to the traders. So for instance, if I was going to export goods from Nigeria to Ghana or Sierra Leone, right, I could rely on these middlemen. And these middlemen have been able to build trust on both parties. And they act as guarantors, saying, yes, I will guarantee that these goods will be delivered to this other party, and I would guarantee that this party will make their payments. So these middlemen are actually products of, in most cases, families and kinship, and maybe religious ties and cultural ties. And in most cases, they act as guarantors and provide those specific rich form of resources to traders operating across different border markets. Now, we also found out that the entrepreneurs operating within sub-Saharan Africa relied on cultural norms of family and kinship. Now, a lot of these traders, so for instance, those operating in Nigeria have families in Ghana, in Cameroon, in Sierra Leone, in Liberia. And because these are family networks across operating across different border markets, trade appears to be very efficient, because there appears to be the idea around family within the developing market context is very strong compared to what we find in mature economies. And again, the wealth of one particular member appears to be the wealth of everyone. So in terms of family and kinship, there's always that strong network tie. And as such, this kind of underpins trade relationships. So partners within Nigeria can do business effectively with their counterparts in other markets. And these families can also these family and kinship ties can also adopt the role of middlemen in ensuring that they're able to drive into new markets, explore new markets, and also provide opportunities for entrepreneurial growth. Now, in terms of sanctions, we realize that when people violate trust, right, there are key sanctions put in place. And these sanctions can be seen as enforcement. So for instance, when people break trust or when there is distrust in place, sanctions can be ostracization or reputation damage. And because the core of these entrepreneurs operating within sub-Saharan Africa and parts of West Africa have been doing this business for many years, right, they're always very keen on maintaining their reputation. And as such, because once you have a damaged reputation, because that is all that kind of enhances the trust. What is a reputation damage? What it means is that people won't do business with you. And there's this informal gossip that permeates across the market. And as such, you'll be ostracized from any form of trade. So what happens is that people are very quick to ensure, entrepreneurs are very quick to ensure that they keep to the terms of their agreements and avoid any sanctions. So these sanctions are often agreed social consensus that ensures that people keep to the ties of their agreements. So before going into the revised conceptual framework, right? So, okay, maybe I can touch on the revised conceptual framework. So in terms of the revised conceptual framework, this kind of builds on the original conceptual framework. So what research found out is that within Africa and within large parts of sub-Saharan Africa, there is a prevalence of weak formal institutions, in this sense, law courts. So because the law courts are perceived to be weak and inefficient, all the entrepreneurs kind of mentioned that they wouldn't waste time to the court because of its bureaucratic elements and because it's very rich and because in most cases it's assumed to be very corrupt. So they now rely on alternative forms of institutions, which are family culture, and trade associations. Now, within the research, we found out that the personal trust, which is trust based on working relationships and middlemen, appear to be very strong and act as compensation to weak formal institutions. In situations whereby entrepreneurs appear to engage in distrust, they are often sanctioned, and sanctions can include reputation damage and ostracization. And in terms of institutional trust, the strong elements of institutional trust are trust based on family and kinship, trust based on culture, trust based on religion, trust based on indigenous trade associations. Now, in situations whereby entrepreneurs have engaged in distrust and are willing to repair their relationship and have given a commitment not to engage in malfeasance again, right, there are some kind of key approaches to repairing trust. And this include verbal explanations. And here there must be sincerity at play. There must be apologies. In the research, we find out there's a prevalence of the use of intermediaries, right? And intermediaries could be local elders, it could be church leaders, it could be trade leaders, and the trade leaders will act as intermediaries in resolving trust when trust has been broken. And once trust has been broken, this leads to, this ensures that relationships are more sustained and enhanced. So in terms of the implications, because I'm kind of mindful of the timing. So in terms of practical implications, what this study has kind of highlighted is that entrepreneurs operating within sub-Saharan Africa continue to operate in the informal economy. And to a very strong extent, the informal economy within sub-Saharan Africa has been largely ignored. But in this research, there's a strong element that shows that there are strong opportunities and advantages to be derived from the informal economy. And within the research, again, the strength of indigenous institutions is amplified. Indigenous institutions such as family, trade associations are proven to be very useful in enhancing regional trade. And in most cases, when we look at donor associations like the DFID or USAID, and maybe elements of UNICEF and United Nations, often look at the Western models, right, and try to transplant that to Africa. And in most cases, it often leads to incorrect macro theorizations, and of course, misplaced interpretations of Nigerian indigenous institutions. So there's a need to kind of look at how to enhance those informal institutions to ensure that they can kind of contribute to Nigeria and of course to Africa's GDP. Now, in terms of the policy implications, there's a need for reforms of formal institutions. There's a need to reform the courts and the police force to ensure that this kind of enhances entrepreneurship within Nigeria and parts of sub-Saharan Africa. And I think the neglect of informal institutions can actually justify why parts of sub-Saharan Africa remain undeveloped or can still be characterized as less mature economies. But I think one of the key elements of this indigenous institution is the fact that they kind of compensate the weakness of the formal institutions, providing access to credit, providing access to new markets, providing access to non-collateralized interest-free loans. So I think future policy considerations can look at how governments and policymakers can drive and enhance indigenous institutional structures within Nigeria. Now, in my observation, when I was traveling, I realized there was an absence of banks within the market in which I did my investigation. And I think some of the recommendations could be how formal institutions such as banks can actually support entrepreneurs operating in the informal economy to ply their trade, especially within sub-Saharan Africa. In terms of theoretical consideration, I think the concept of institutional theory has been belabored within economic sociology and within entrepreneurship and within sociology. And I think the research kind of lays a foundation for the concept of institutional rivalry, which I would say is the interplay between two institutions, that formal and informal institutions, which for me, I kind of contend is a new concept in the conversations around institution. Now, in terms of theoretical contributions, again, the study refutes the fact that while the Western model of trust appears to be sufficient, the study kind of adopts an emic ethic view, suggesting that trust can be cultural, generic, can be general and universal, and trust can also be cultural specific. In terms of theory, again, I think one of the key findings of the research is that trust has been actually built over generations within sub-Saharan Africa. And this trust has kind of laid the foundation for socially embedded structures of family and kinship. And this kind of, this still thrives within Africa and within sub-Saharan Africa, and has led to very strong cross-border networks and cross-border trade within such context. And I think one of the key elements of my research, which for some reason, which for constraint of time, I was unable to illuminate, was the element of reflexivity, which I adopted in the research, because one, I was able to immerse myself into the real world, right? I can remember having lived with them for 4 weeks. I was able to gain access into the way they did their business. I can remember at the time when I was leaving, they didn't want me to leave because they had enjoyed the fact that I was now a player within the market. I was privileged to have also undertaken business and trade with them. I was privileged to have seen how they did trust and how they provided credit without a need for collateral, without the need for any agreements. I think the idea of reflexivity appears to be rare within research. And for me, I believe that methodological strategy is rare for qualitative research. The use of reflexivity, whereby researchers are able to provide an introspection of their research, can provide a very strong approach to undertaking qualitative research today. So I think I'll probably stop here and probably take questions. I suspect there'll be lots of questions in the research, and I'll be happy to take questions as they come. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Christian.
Thank you very much, King, for that very informative and interesting presentation. It was good to see how trust how it's viewed from the developing market context, and especially from the Nigerian context, like you rightly pointed out. So, questions for you. I think I get questions. Anybody that wants to ask questions in person before we go to the charts? Any questions about what King has said that you want to? Any or comments, feedback? This is the time for you to ask your questions before we go to the chart. Okay, let's start with the chart first before we start warming up for in-person questions. I think the first question is from John. So that's John from the States. How did corruption in the system affect trust in the system? In the US, there has been a lot of government grants or special tax breaks given for the development of specific development with the promise of jobs, but the promises are rarely materialized, like the building of stadiums or the modernization of factories. The jobs promised rarely benefits to the working community, and in case of factories, often causes layoffs. No benefit to the working people of the community. It is something I saw in peer review journals time and time again in the US. Did you see any relationship between trust versus mistrust, top-down versus grassroots economic development? Overall, how did it affect economic development? So I think there are a lot of questions in one question. So the first question really is about corruption. So how did corruption in the system affect trust in the system? Then before you go into, is there any relationship between trust versus mistrust and top-down versus grassroots? Overall, how did it affect economic development? So over to you, King.
Thank you very much, Christian. And thank you, John. I think that's a very loaded question, but a very apt and very relevant one. And I think if you look at the world today, and perhaps let's look at it from a more mature economy, look at the UK or the US, you realize with the way politics is going, there's a very high propensity for people to distrust governments. And it's because one, because the idea around trust is a set of shared expectations between people in a relationship. So the electorate and the government. Now, when governments say they will do what they're supposed to do and they don't do it, what does that do? It leads to distrust, right? And that is what is obtainable within the UK as it is today. And of course, in other mature economies, also, for instance, also in the USA, during the Trumpian era, and of course, the era of Boris Johnson. Now, the truth is, if you take a quick survey around the UK, Scotland, and USA, you realize that people no longer trust the government. Why? And why is that so? Is because, well, the government haven't lived up to expectations. And this kind of underscores Zucker's definition of trust being those set of shared expectations. So the truth is, once people don't live up to the expectations, right, there would always be distrust. Now, but that doesn't mean trust can be repaired. Trust can be repaired. But I think one thing that the mature economies like the West have going for them is the prevalence of strong institutions that in some way are more credible and can be relied on, right? More than what you get in less mature economies. And now taking that to less mature economies, I think the idea of distrust is kind of underpinned by corruption, and I hate to use the word corruption, and because one, while in the West there are elements of distrust, there are kind of institutional arrangements that kind of underpins and strengthens the way people live. These are institutions that kind of govern the way people live. But however, one, in the developing market context in most sub-Saharan Africa, there is that very strong element of what we call systematic corruption or systematic distrust. And this has been in existence post-colonial era in most parts of developing market context. And in some way, and in a very strong case, this has kind of eaten deep into all the institutional arrangements, the courts, the banks, the politics. There is that very strong propensity for people not to believe in institutions. Now, within the context of this research, it's the focus was on the informal economy now and the informal entrepreneurs. Now, the informal entrepreneurs now do not rely on the formal institutions. Because the formal institutions, have been argued to be for the exclusivity of the rich, right? It's also assumed to be very expensive. So, for instance, an average person cannot go into the courts and expect to win a case. Because the courts within developing market context takes a lot of time. The court appears to be for the rich. So if you've got more money, you can actually win a case in the courts. Now, there appears to be arbitrary decisions taken by court officials that may have been bought over by rich clients. So some of these kind of underpins some of the systematic failures of legal arrangements. So, and this kind of trickles down into the way people perceive institutions within developing market context. And as such, a very high degree of distrust sets in, not just in the informal economy, and also within the formal economy, right? So what has happened is that entrepreneurs operating in the formal economy have tried to look for alternative forms of institutional arrangements that can help them enhance their enterprise and also help them ensure economic development. So overall, how did it affect economic development? Absolutely. So looking at the fact that these formal institutions have not been able to provide a strong safeguard for these entrepreneurs, they've now looked at informal institutions to help them thrive, to help them enhance their enterprise, to help them do business across borders, and also help them make a living.
Thank you very much, King, for that. I think, John, is that okay? Are your questions been answered? Or do you want King to elaborate more?
That's a different John. Oh, I thought that's John.
It's not Professor John. It's this John from the States.
Yeah, no, a great answer. It's just that the widespread nature of corruption, even in developed markets, is shocking if you actually sit down and look at it, right down to some of the government officials that are representing us. So it's one of those ongoing problems, I think, that are really starting to get into people's attentions. And you could look back at, in the States, we had the fraud, the subprime mortgage fraud in 2007, 2008, that actually collapsed the subprime markets, which ultimately almost collapsed the entire world economy. And if you look back, there's only been one person who was prosecuted for the fraud that they were taking part in. All these thousands of other people who participated actively in the fraud were never prosecuted. So if it's here at that magnitude, then I could only imagine how it is in less developed economies.
Absolutely, John, and I do agree with you. And the truth is, it kind of underscores the element that even in the West, that the courts and institutions are also for the rich. So yesterday I was reading a report, and I realized that Ernst & Young had been fined $100 million. Now, what did Ernst & Young do, right? So they had people within their ethical department. They were meant to enhance or guide ethics within their department, but they didn't take the exams, and they lied that they took the exams. Now, these are the ethical gatekeepers, meant to be gatekeepers within the institutions. But rather than do the exams, they took away all element of ethics and lied that they took the examinations. And these are the ethical gatekeepers. Now, normally, these people and these people are meant to probably go on trial or go to court or pay for those kind of malfeasance, but they were only given a fine, right? But you can imagine if that was done by an average person. So it kind of underscores the element that trust is actually, those institutions have been actually been bought over by the rich, and it's not really different from what you get in developing market context, where these institutions and these arrangements appear to be for the exclusivity of the rich. And issues around tax payment, again, is something we can also go into debate about, how those are also for the wealthy person, for the wealthy part of the society. So I think the element of distrust, again, is not just common to developing market context, but it's common across board. But the idea is, are there institutions that are in place to kind of ensure that that people's choices and that people's economic decisions can be safeguarded? Professor John Struthers, I see your hand up. Sorry for keeping you waiting.
So John, thanks, King, for that.
Yeah, thanks, Kingsley. Nice to see you again on Zoom. There's a lot in your talk, and the role of trust is really vital, of course, in trade and economic relationships. But when you were presenting your research, I was thinking of a few points, really. One is the phrase that comes to mind here is, necessity is the mother of invention, or should it be mother/father of invention in these current times. And what I mean by that is, you seem to be implying that in Africa, at least sub-Saharan Africa, although most of your research is done in Nigeria, as far as I know. So I think, far be it from me, not being African, to tell an African not to generalize across the whole continent, but I'm going to say that because, I wouldn't necessarily generalize across 54 countries. I always say this in Kareed and so on. So I think you have to be careful about generalizing across sub-Saharan Africa based on research in one country. I know there's other similar research done on this topic in other African countries, but I think there's a danger of that. But that's just an aside. I mean, you seem to be suggesting that because of the lack of development of formal institutions, that trade flourishes on the basis of informal institutions, cultural kinship, and so on and so on and so on, which we know exist in Africa and indeed in every society, every economy. But in terms of holding the economic development back, this is not a permanent solution to the problem, in my book. Otherwise, we wouldn't have, the continent wouldn't have agreed an African continental free trade agreement, which is designed to reduce the transaction costs of trade. And I think it would be useful to look at the negative effects of these informal networks. As you tend to focus on the positive aspects, which is good, because I think, the literature and people in developed countries and mature economies tend to look down on these informal networks, and that's wrong because, well, they exist here as well. So, and I think there's a kind of neo-colonial attitude towards it. I agree with you on that, but you tend to be too optimistic about the role of these informal networks, because at the end of the day, when it comes to trade, cross-border trade in particular, it's all about sort of rules and regulations and compliance and paying taxes and paying customs duties and things like this. And I'll just finish on this point because I'll give you a very good example of this. We recently ran a project in, I won't mention the sub-Saharan African country because there'll be people here who maybe are not at the university, so I'll keep it slightly confidential, but it is a sub-Saharan African country. And my colleagues here from UWS probably know which one it is. And we had to ship some equipment over to this country for the project. And the customs duty that we paid was nearly half of the cost of the equipment itself. Now that's inefficient. And that's why development is slow. in Africa. And so I would suggest that while it is right to analyze and research trust in the context that you've described it, Kingsley, I think that maybe you're sugarcoating it too much. You know, I'm very frank in these discussions. Academic discussion should be slightly provocative. So I think you are a little bit sugarcoating the benefits of these informal trust relationships. Let's have both. Let's have formal development of institutions along the Douglas North sort of route, as well as the sort of lubrication that we can get from informal trust networks. They're complementary.
Absolutely.
They're not competitive. I'm sorry, it's a bit of a long diatribe from me, but it's a very interesting area of research. It really is, and I think it's good that you're doing that research, because, as I said at the beginning, and as you said, it's under researched. But I think we need a more balanced view of the sort of the costs and benefits of it. You wouldn't expect me to say anything else as an economist, I suppose.
John, I'll join you with that example. You know, when you said you sent this equipment inexpensive. My experience, I was running an MSc International Business in Kazakhstan, and this is a EU project funded by EU, and then we send books to the students, and those students are supposed to be staff in 3 universities. So when we got to the customs, they wanted to make us pay for transit. And he said, no, this is academic. This is a part of the exchange of things. And they didn't want to know it. So we had to do all this going around and networking to get a piece of paper to exempt us to pay for the transit. And the money they were trying to make us pay for, it was more than the textbooks. So that's my experience as well. I had that a couple of years ago, you know, when I was running this course in Kazakhstan. Yeah, for coming back to King, you know, the topic it takes me back to a long time, you know, 2019, when I attended, you know, your transfer event at the time, and then I found it interesting, quite complex, and then still interesting, but still complex, and then I'm still struggling sometimes to have this panoramic view. And then I wish you had looked at the problem from a systemic approach. You have taken one side and examined it in depth. Let's say, for example, you're looking for the informal economy, and then you included the, you know, internationalization there. Somebody who is not properly recognized in the country and doing those dealing informal, underground economy and all that, not paying taxes or doing other things, and then having a partner abroad. So what's this type of relationship? You know, the internationalization, are they the same type? How do they get through the customs? This is one of the things I have in my mind still. I'm struggling to understand that. Okay, you know, looking at the other organization like church, probably to be there for the trust, for the informal contract between the dealers. Yes, I understand that. That you can find that on all tribes and all that in most of the other countries as well. But I have also a methodological concern, not a real concern, but something, you know, you've done, you said I spent like 4 weeks. I was involved with the entrepreneurs. I was part of the trading and all that. And then in your approach, you used the interviews. You have taken notes, which is understandable. But where is the grounded theory here? You haven't mentioned that, because you were living with them. You are doing the same thing. You are observing, but you haven't mentioned anything relating to the grounded theory. And you use the term theoretical sampling, which is which comes from grounded theory. So I wonder why that was missed out. That's my question.
Okay, I'll take your question first before I go to Professor John's question. So in terms of grounded theory, and the focus of my research wasn't the generation of theory, which is grounded in data, which has been systematically collected, analyzed. Although my goal was to uncover such things as the social relationships and the the behaviors of groups and the social processes, my main goal was to kind of advance theory. Now, the research, I didn't really, my goal wasn't to follow Glaser and Strauss's 1967 approach to legitimize my qualitative research. That was not the core of my research. The core of my research was to explore how these entrepreneurs within their context rely on formal institutions and more or less understand the real world and the social meanings and the social interpretations of their way of life. Now, the idea of what I call a partial ethnographic approach, because for me, understanding of ethnography is that it should be longitudinal. But for me, I found it difficult to gain access to their real world. And it took me, because I had to travel to key elements of northern Nigeria to be able to have access to their real world. And it took me spending weeks living with these entrepreneurs to understand how they do trust. Now, remember, the context of this research is trust. Trust is an abstract context, concepts such as happiness. It's difficult to pinpoint trust. So you need to immerse yourself to be able to understand how these people rely on trust and how they build on trust. Now, your second question was on the issue of customs. And because this research is a very, very big research, it's 400 pages. So it's a research that kind of looks at a more, would I say, unique phenomenon. The idea of customs came into play. Now, you did mention the element of internationalization, and the internationalization theory, right, builds on the fact that these entrepreneurs try to do business with other entrepreneurs in other sub-Saharan countries or other border markets. Now, the idea is, how do they go through customs? Now, this is where the element of trust comes in. Now, most of the border people, most of the border agents are also in their networks. Now, the custom agent, because the border agents already have a relationship with some of these entrepreneurs and some of the trade associations, they often turn a blind eye when these entrepreneurs want to export their goods out of the country. In some cases, they take what we call egunje, which are more like bribes or kickbacks, to ensure that these entrepreneurs are able to export their goods outside of the country. As part of my research, what I also found out, most of these custom agents also act as middlemen. And this is very interesting. Now, as middlemen, rather than doing their jobs as custom agents, they also help facilitate trade by acting as middlemen, by taking one good from one part of the country and exporting to other parts of Western Africa. Now, this kind of takes me to Professor John's question, whereby he did mention about the issue of generalizing. I would argue, yes, in terms of generalizing, the findings of my research can be applied to countries at the same development stages with Nigeria. But saying that the research focused on Nigeria would be taking the shine of the research, because one, the 52 entrepreneurs who are more or less Nigerians operated across 12 different sub-Saharan Africa, 12 different sub-Saharan countries. A lot of them operated in the big markets of Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso, Cotonou, Accra and Kumasi in Ghana, Liberia, Benin, and Sierra Leone, and to mention a few. And a lot of them kind of identified similarities across the way business is done within Nigeria and in those societies. So the key elements, the key dysfunctional elements of institutions were prevalent in those markets, in Cotonou, in Ouagadougou, in Ghana, in Liberia, and in Benin. Now, I do agree with you, Professor John Stott, where you mentioned the danger of having a romanticized view of informal institutions. And I do agree, because what I did find out is the essence of what we call amoral familism, whereby people within a network are being partners to a network kind of limits your ability to kind of expand beyond your network. And I do agree with you. And also I agree with your point that informal sector, they contribute, but there's also a need to focus on informal institutions. But let me refer you to an IFC 2020 report where they pointed out that 92% of Nigeria's entrepreneurs operate in the informal sector. And they also kind of point out that Nigeria's GNI per capita is still at a miserly $12,746. So what it means is that if we have an economy, whereby 90% of its workforce still operate in the informal sector. You can imagine bringing those 90% out of the informal sector to play in the formal sector. That will lead to GDP, that will lead to an increase in per capita income, that will lead to an increase in income generation. It's a no-brainer that there are opportunities in the informal sector. I agree that there are challenges, there are weaknesses, there's a danger of having a romanticized view, but there's a need to also look at how to strengthen the informal sector, how to ensure that the barriers and bottlenecks preventing them from operating in the informal sector can be reduced. Key examples of key solutions can be one, providing them with access to single loans. Nigeria and other developing market contexts have access to the Bank of Industries. It's in Ghana, it's in Cote d'Ivoire. These banks can offer single-digit loans to SMEs and micro SMEs. Now, other elements can be providing trade arbitrary institutions, such as courts, to make sure that arbitrary trade grievances can easily be resolved. So, what I'm saying in essence is, if you look at the Nigerian informal economy, right, the entrepreneurs operate largely in the manufacturing and services sector, right? And a lot of them, and that's about 82, and both sectors kind of contribute 82% to Nigeria's GDP. So if we can decide to move these people out of the informal economy, then one can argue that, of course, it will complement, like you mentioned, complement the growth of the formal economy, and also generate an increased revenue for Nigeria's economy, and by extension, large parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Thank you.
King, sorry, I don't want to, this is my last question. Do you agree that the high percentage of informal economy is driven by the corruption, because people, just entrepreneurs and the trader, they avoid to use voices, any trace of a trade. And then if you go, okay, I can sell you this lot, I can sell you this merchandise, but I do not give you any piece of paper. I don't want the taxman to come and get me. And then the same trader, the same entrepreneur does it with his clients as well. And then that's what increases the number of informal economy.
Okay, I'll put it this way, right? Within Nigeria and large parts of sub-Saharan Africa, right, the informal economy continues to play an important role. And this is because their activities to a large extent have been largely ignored, because their activities can neither be regulated or measured. I think the true notion here is that these entrepreneurs or these SMEs have chosen to remain players in the informal economy because, not because of corruption per se, because they are unable to benefit. They are unable to benefit from the opportunities of the formal economy, right? Because one, they can't gain access to some of the difficult and high regulations in place. And of course, this is also underscoring your point, in addition to the weakness of those formal institutions, such as law courts, and banks. So one may argue that the activities, if enhanced and if supported, can prove to be a source of development for Nigeria and broader Africa. So I think the main reason why they've chosen to remain in the informal economy is because it's difficult. So, for instance, the task of registering a company in Nigeria is very expensive. Now, most of this, that will set you back, if I convert that to pounds, to register a business in Nigeria, probably set you back like £500, or let's say $500, right? So rather than this having these bottlenecks trying to constrain your business or your enterprise development, what you realize is that these SMEs will choose to remain players in the informal economy because, in real sense, they can't really enjoy the benefits that the formal economy has to provide to them.
So I'll come back later. I'll let my colleagues here to ask questions. I've got another question I'll ask you later.
Okay, thanks, John and Ahmed for that. I think there's a question from Tini in the chat, and states, did the stereotype and cultural or tribal prejudice come to play in how trust is perceived in the process during your research? So the stereotype and cultural or tribal prejudice come to play, and did you directly or indirectly perceive such in your data gathering process?
Well, I think that's a very unique question, and I think Timmy has kind of pointed out at the core essence of this study. So the idea around this study was to kind of understand how trust works around some very key cultural blocks, and these cultural blocks are kind of entrepreneurs across Nigeria's main cultural blocks, right, operating across sub-Saharan Africa. Now, within Nigeria has about 250 cultural ethnic blocks, but three main cultural blocks stand out. There's the Yoruba, Igbo, and Hausa. And across these three cultural blocks, there are there were commonalities and there were differences. So for the Yorubas, right, for the Yoruba cultural blocks operating across sub-Saharan Africa, they relied more on religious associations. They relied more on Pentecostal religious associations such as NASFAT, which encourages external trade, encourages socio-economic empowerment of its members. Now, the Igbos kind of relied more on trade associations, and they kind of acknowledge the immense help that these associations help them in their exporting business. Now, in the Hausas, they relied more on religion, and they believe that by doing trust, right, with people within the Muslim network, they kind of had more confidence. So, for instance, for them to do business, they will bring their Quran and they will ask the other parties to swear on the Quran. That kind of gives them more confidence. But I think one of the key traditional bias, which I found out, was that some of the Igbo traders that believed more in oral agreements cemented their trade based on traditional gods. So a lot of them, rather than relying on the traditional forms of, rather than relying on Christianity or Islam, they still believe in traditional gods. And in believing in traditional gods, they were able to do trade with members that actually had the same godlike belief with them, because they believe that there will be sanctions such as curses, and they need to take oaths to kind of ensure that trade works. So yes, I do agree with you that there were similarities, there were differences, there were ethnic biases across board, absolutely. I can go into detail trying to provide commonalities and differences across the three cultural blocks. But one thing I did realize was there was a strong element of Christianity, of religion, culture, family and kinship, trade associations underpinning supporting trust within this context.
Hey, thanks very much, King, for that. I think you answered a question, Timmy. Are you happy with the answer, Timmy?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, that's good. And I think Professor Jonas.
Just a very quick point. I'm going to disagree with you, Kingsley, totally on this last answer you gave. The great thing about capitalism and the great thing about the market economy is it is apolitical, it is acultural, it's sometimes ahistorical, and there must be some other aspect, I can't remember what it is. In other words, and it's apersonal. In other words, trade doesn't need religion, doesn't need culture, doesn't need history. All it needs is good laws and gains from trade, as Adam Smith famously said. And so I'm being rather awkward today, because I'm suggesting that unless we get rid of culture from trade and religion from trade, or at least if it has to persist, it's subsumed within economic relationships, then the countries don't develop, just don't develop. Because the one implication of what you're saying is that it's fine for this informal trade to continue, indeed to flourish and to expand. I would disagree. I think it's a major obstacle to development. And what you need to do is, and this is how most developed countries have thrived, is to formalize the informal sector, which of course means taxing the informal sector. Because it's through tax revenue that then infrastructure is developed, and that the formal system, the formal institutions become more effective and efficient. I mean, a couple of speakers today have spoken about corruption and so on in developed economies, in mature economies. But what is the big difference between corruption in a developed economy and a less developed economy is that corruption tends to be at the very margins of a mature economy. Most economic transactions in mature economies obey the law and are very trustful. How do we know that? Because they persist and they survive. With distrustful relationships or corrupt relationships, they might thrive one year, but then they're not sustainable. So it's not really a question, it's more of a comment, but I'm sorry, I tend to disagree with you there. And this is what academics should do. We should disagree with each other
exactly.
in a nice way, in a nice diplomatic way.
Exactly. I think that's, sorry for cutting in both of you short. I think that's the whole idea of this seminar. Everybody, you present your opinion, and of course, academics also present theirs. So there is no wrong answer, like I always say. So King, I think you want to make some.
Absolutely, and thank you once again, Dr. Professor John Struthers. But again, I would really, really disagree with you. I think for me, it's very important that we try to avoid macro theorizations, because the truth is we can't really transplant models from mature economies to to different economies, because one, there are kind of contextual undertones shaping both divides. Now, I do recognize the fact that you mentioned about Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, but one of the challenges with Adam Smith's work was that, one, he kind of overlooked certain context. And this is why proponents of institutional theory have kind of moved from institutional theory to new economic institutions to new elements of the institutional logics, whereby they try to highlight the elements of social, cultural, economic, and normative environments. Now, the truth within Africa to date, pre-colonial times to date, is that Nigeria's institutional context is comprised of socio-cultural, economic environments, which influence entrepreneurial action. Now, this context mobilizes resources as well as constrain or enable entrepreneurial behavior. Now, you can't discard that. Now, and this is why I always argue that it's very difficult to transplant those kind of models. While I do agree with you that there's a need to support informal economy, the idea of taxation defeats the purpose, because the question is, why do they operate in the informal economy? It's because, one, they cannot meet up to the demand of the formal economy. The recommendation here, or a very adequate prescription here, is how do we support the informal economy to be more players and contribute to economic growth? Now, let me point
Sorry, Kingsley, it's the opposite. Let me just come in, because I do have to go. I do have to leave the meeting. I do have to leave the meeting soon. Let me just make one point. You're totally wrong on this point. We have to devise ways of eliminating the informal sector.
Okay, can I address that now? So let me point you to Douglas North's work, 1990. And what did he define institutions? He defined institutions as the rules of the game. He defines institutions as formal institutions, which are the constitutional legal frameworks. And the informal institutions comprise uncodified embedded attitudes, values, norms, codes, and conduct within a society, and these are prevalent within Nigeria. I think the seminal argument here is that institutions and organizations are affected by their social context, and this is not new. And this is what happens in Africa. Now, the idea is within Africa, the institutions comprising commercial laws and courts, which ensure compliance of contractual obligations, are weak. Now, the argument is that the developing economies, the informal economies, will have to possess distinct and different institutional settings, different from those that you get in developed economies. And this is why most of these entrepreneurs operate in the informal sector and rely on other indigenous institutional arrangements. Now, saying you want to eradicate the informal sector, I think is way out of point. It's way out of the conversation, because it's almost impossible. The goal here will be, how do we support them? Because, one, they are critical to enterprise creation, they are critical to economic growth. And this is symptomatic of number of developing market economies, because, one, informal economies and entrepreneurs operating in informal economies are influenced by the limitations of formal institutions and have resulted to looking at more informal ways of doing business. I think this is quite pertinent because these regulatory enforcement regimes and the structures are inadequate. I'll probably stop there because I know
I think we need to stop, isn't it? We're running out of time. But thank you so much for the debates. I think no, Ahmed, but we're not going for another debate talk because we will not leave here if we continue. But I think just the last word, I think it's from John. John is saying, I would like to learn more about informal trade networks and how they are affecting the developing trade within participating countries. Thank you for the presentation. I enjoyed the content and discussion. From an author's perspective in reaching markets, the rise of the use of smartphones is causing growing markets for writing in Africa. I do not know much more than the opportunities that exist, but I do know the particulars of our authors are connecting. I think it's more like a comment, isn't it, from John? So that's good. So either way, I think Temi is saying quite an engaging session. I totally agree with you, Temi. This has been one of the most engaging sessions we've had in a long time. You can see a lot of interaction, and that is great. And then Craig is saying, sorry, I need to drop off for my final meeting at the evening. So either way, I think it's, thanks everyone for coming. Great discussion, great interaction, very informative session as well. Thank you so much, King. Thank you for everybody that was involved. Thank you, Ahmed. Thank you, John, Timmy, everybody. Yes, sorry, Ahmed, because I know you want to ask another question.
I disagree. I go along with John. Okay, I disagree with him. I've got a good example. I can catch up with you.
We'll catch up later. We'll catch up later.
Why it doesn't work.
Okay. We'll catch up later.
Okay, I agree. You can all catch up, maybe the roundtable discussion.
We'll catch up in carried.
Exactly. I have that conversation. But I think we have to close because we don't want to go beyond time. Thanks everybody for being involved. In the next 2 weeks, we're having another speaker talking about crisis, almost similar to what trust crisis. We have very, very nice teams engaging. So please watch this space. But on behalf of the school, we're glad and thank you so much for everybody, to everyone, and especially Dr. King for honoring our invitation. Thank you and see you all later. Take care.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Bye, Ahmed. Bye, John. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.